and welcome to our CESI Talks Just Transitions, a project with the support of the European Parliament, where we talk to policymakers and experts on the field of transitions in order to answer the challenges that await us. Today, we're really pleased to have the Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre, Mr. Fabian Zuleeg. Thank you and welcome. And our CESI Secretary General, Mr. Klaus Heeger. So welcome to the both of you. We know that it is a very difficult time, a lot of things going on and changes in our world and our geopolitical scenario. We just thought that we were gonna get out of the pandemic and we were gonna recover. And now it's been almost more than a month of war at our doorstep. So I wanna ask you, the both of you, a couple of questions first. And what do you think will be the consequences of the war in Ukraine for Europe, and what will be the changing geopolitical setting mean for the European Union? And Mr. Zuleeg, if you could take the floor first.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me. It is always difficult to make these kind of assessments in the middle of a situation which is changing and developing on a daily basis. But I think it is actually easier to say some of the things about the longer term than it is about the shorter term. In the shorter term, there will have to be reactions to what happens on the ground. My contention would be that there's more we have to do because this conflict isn't over and there has to be more pressure on Russia. But if I look at the longer term, I think there are some major shifts which we are already seeing, which will have a huge implication for the European Union and actually for all of our policy areas. So that would be my first major takeaway at this moment in time, is that we have to really go and look at all the policy areas which we cover. Some of the policy areas which we don't cover yet at the European level, or we don't cover to a greater extent at the European level, and reassess all of them. And it might well end up with us having a very different view of what the European Union should do, how it should do that, what kind of decision-making processes we need. We need, for example, a new industrial policy which can respond to the challenges which are there. We need a new energy policy, which has to deal with the reality of a decoupling from Russian market. We will have to have a new migration policy. We will have to have a new agricultural policy, a new policy of solidarity within the Union. We will have to find new ways of also achieving the kind of objectives we set before this invasion. So if we are talking about the objectives of economic recovery, but also the transitions which we know we have to go through in terms of climate protection, in terms of technology. We have to have a different foreign policy, a different defense, a different security policy. We will have huge fiscal implications of all of that, which will in turn have an implication for economic governance. The list is as long as the policies we cover. So this is my great takeaway from this. It's not necessarily that we already know what will happen in all of these areas, but that we know that we have to reassess them. And my second big takeaway is that, and here it comes really to a policy option. I think what the current situation shows us is in a way the promise of the European Union. We have always talked about the possibility of being stronger together. If we come together, we are able to do things we can't do by ourselves. But in many areas, we have shied away from actually putting that into practice. Now, what the current situation has shown that, yes, indeed, if we do act together, we still have a very significant weight in the world. We can still defend our interests and values in a very effective way. Of course, in alliance with others, in support of others, but in the end, the action which has been taken at the European level is one of the decisive factors in this whole conflict. But it is a choice. And in the end, we will have to come back to the discussions around European integration do we want to do that? Are we willing to accept the compromises, the trade-offs which come with that? For example, that certain powers will have to be transferred to whatever kind of European level we consider. So these are, for me, the two big first takeaways. But as I said, I mean, we have to continue also reacting to the short term. And in that, I think it's always important to emphasize that it's the Ukraine which is taking the brunt of this, and that it's the people of Ukraine who are suffering immensely under all of this, and that we have to do all we can to help both reactively in terms of hosting the refugees which are coming across the border, providing the humanitarian aid, but also proactively in supporting Ukraine and supporting also Ukraine with weapons, as we have done up to now.
Yes, Mrs. Zuleeg, it's not important enough to stress how much support and solidarity is needed for Ukraine, and we need to show it anytime we can and in any occasion and mean that we have possible. And to you, Mr. Heeger, what do you think the implications of the war will be?
Yeah, I'm not a military expert. I'm not an economist, and I find it very, very difficult at this stage, also after what Fabian said, that the implications are so manifold to make clear statements on that. I think we're living in a period of extraordinary uncertainty, and I mean, we have, of course, the uncertainty of the war. The war has been lasting now for over 4 weeks, and it should have been over for quite a while, and still. The Russians, as it appears, are losing ground. So something which is really unexpected. I'm a little bit scared, worried myself that if the war keeps on dragging, that the implications, the consequences, both in military terms, but also in humanitarian, economic terms, will be continuously devastating. I think we also have, I fully support what Fabian said. We have to think first and foremost also at those in the front line, meaning all the worries we're having now are secondary. And yet, I think there are some predictions already we can make, to my mind, is that Russia will, of course, be isolated now beyond the war for many years. And that there will be also, as Fabian said, major shifts. Now, I'm speaking also as a trade unionist, of course. We will have the global supply chains under pressure. We will face shortages. We will face disruptions. We will face maybe political destabilization. We're having already now a strong, worrying energy and food inflation, and many speak already of an industrial emergency that we will have to face. And I'm speaking here as a trade unionist. I refer to also what our president yesterday said. We need to be ready for hardships. And we have to tell, I think also this was said on one of the EPC events, we have to tell the people also it is war. And we have to face that. And this will have implications also on all our lives. I think we will need a lot of money. You know, we are already now at record public debt levels, and we need more money, public money for military spending, for support and integration for refugees. We have to mitigate the impacts of energy and food inflation. And of course, we need also a lot of money, as was said previously, for the pandemic recovery, for fair and digital green transitions, for public infrastructure, for public services. And we have to see, of course, that we cannot finance everything with debt. And that leaves me a little bit, brings me to say again, it will probably mean cuts in our wealth. And what scenarios for the future? I was mentioning that earlier. I see Russia will be isolated for a very long time. And I think we realize that the principle of economic interdependence does not guarantee necessarily international political stability, as we've seen now. And then we will have to somehow, that's what experts say, at least political observers, split the world economy in, let's see, at least two parts, meaning the Western and the Eastern part. And also divide the global value chains. And that, I mean, that reflects also what has been said by the heads of state, by everybody last week, but also already in Versailles. We need more strategic independence in terms of energy supply, commodities, food, essential industries, supply and production chains. Of course, we spoke a lot about it, Sara, about critical raw materials, and also a new geopolitical focus, which still has to be determined yet. So we will need determination. I think we'll need stamina and perseverance. And I see also always trying to see the positive side that, of course, the more independent we become, the more also we may create jobs also within the European Union. That is a little bit, I would say, the small little light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. And getting back to what Mr. Zuleeg was saying, there needs to be changes in policies. Now, we talked a lot about transitions and how the pandemic accelerated lots of the processes of the transitions. The war is affecting these transitions as well. Obviously, the European Union first reactions were on sanctions and obviously on defense. So talks also about a European army and how to strengthen that. And obviously a first reaction about energy, because we're so dependent on Russian supplies. Mr. Zuleeg, how do you think the war will affect the energy transition in Europe? Will it slow it down or will it speed it up?
I think firstly, in the medium term, we will get to a situation where we will be decoupled from Russia. I think that has to be the starting point. We know now, as Klaus was also saying, that we cannot rely on interdependence. And in a way, we have given Russia a lever. And we are from strategic autonomy or whatever term you want to use, we cannot afford to have that in future. So that will mean we have to rebuild our energy infrastructure. And then it comes down to the choices we have in doing that. There are many who have argued that actually what we should have done over the last years is already build this into the system, and that it could have been also a very positive driver of renewables, for example, which would not be dependent on other countries. But I think what we are going to face is inevitably in the short term that some of the goals we had are not going to be met. In the short term, it will be about keeping the lights on. It will be about making sure that we don't have critical shortages. Even when we do all of these things, we still might have some more critical shortages, and we will certainly have distributional impacts as well. So we have to bear that in mind. But the question really is, what do we do in the longer term? And there it comes back to what I was saying before. It's a question of choice. If we go and say to countries, well, essentially we'll leave it up to each individual country to decide how to deal with not only the transitions, but also energy security, which has to be high on the agenda, then I think what we will inevitably end up with is a weakening of our climate protection goals, because some countries will simply say, if that is the case, then we will continue burning coal, we will continue doing the things we are doing at the moment. So if we don't formulate a European plan, a European path of how we get from this immediate emergency situation to a longer term, more structured energy market, which does provide energy security at the same time as providing the kind of ambitious climate protection goals we've had in the past, plus which includes this element of solidarity, making sure that those countries which have very few options also have the opportunity to, for example, use the European electricity market to meet some of their demand, then we are going to fail. And I think this is something where we have to be very honest that there is a danger when you're faced with this kind of threat, that we lose sight of some of the other goals. But when it comes to climate protection, we cannot afford to do that because that is also an existential threat.
Thank you. And Mr. Heeger, what is your point of view on this matter?
Yeah, you know, I think war always makes existing challenges or problems bigger. I mean, somebody phrased it recently, a famous historian, he said, it's difficult to solve the problems of humanity when somebody points a gun at your head. And we already also in a situation where it is difficult to proceed, I would say, to transition in a systematic way if somebody threats you in such a fundamental way. But also to refer to what Fabian has said, that climate protection or the reaction to energy shortages makes you react in a way as a politician, which is totally understandable, is, for instance, that you try to get the energy from wherever you can get it. I mean, we know that Belgium, for instance, will prolong its nuclear plants or the running of its nuclear plants. That has been communicated. We know that Italy, I don't know where you are now in Italy, but that you thought about or think about reopening coal-fired power stations. The German minister, I was referring to that last week, the vice chancellor, the German minister of the economy and climate action, he was to become independent from Russian gas, went to two Gulf countries. I mean, to cut the reliance on Russian gas. And I mean, imagine, and that was Christian Moos was referring to that, how difficult this must have been as a green minister to ask a country for additional the delivery or the supply of additional fossil fuel, and even more so from a country which is certainly not a number one country in terms of human rights. I think, however, we have to see that there is a unprecedented will to reduce dependence from Russian fuels, and that means also, and Habeck was saying that, so first step is to become independent from authoritarian regimes, fossil fuels, and second step is the independence from fossil fuels altogether. And I might, here I'm not in energy policy specialist, but I could imagine that the former may actually, or may altogether be a catalyst for the latter, meaning if you're really determined to to become independent from fossil fuels altogether, and fossil fuels are mainly or largely being supplied by authoritarian regimes, there might be a mutual beneficial situation. Let's see that the independence from fossil fuels altogether might be a little bit catalyzed. So this would be my possible interpretation.
Thank you, Mr. Heeger. And now we have still a little time for a brief response from each one of you. And I wanted to ask one last question to Mr. Zuleeg. How can we assure that these radical changes will not endanger the living standards of the EU citizen? As Mr. Heeger was saying before as well, there's going to be a time where we are going to lack in wealth. So there's going to be repercussions for all of us. How do you think we can go on about that?
I think firstly, we have to recognize that we are in a war here. Yes, we are not the frontline combatants. We're not the ones who have shells dropping on our head. But Putin has declared war on liberal democracy. And in the end, that also means we will have to take cuts in our living standards. We will have to deal with the negative repercussions, and they will not all be cushioned. There are long-term consequences of this, which will reduce standards of living. But we should also not forget that many of us have a very high standard of living. We can afford quite a lot. So what we have to make sure is that we have a cohesiveness in society, that we are not going to end up with having these negative impacts affecting those in our society who are most vulnerable, who are most affected by it. So we have to look at solidarity, both within countries and between countries. And we have to find also the collective will to say this is something which we will bear together. I mean, going back to the sentence of Merkel, wir schaffen das. Yes, we can do it, but we have to do it together. And one plea I would add to that, and time is short, but I think this is really important, that we also have to do that beyond the borders of the European Union, because some of the countries which will be affected here are among the most vulnerable in the world, particularly the food prices issue, but also energy prices will affect them. So if we don't manage to do that, not only is it the right thing to do from a humanitarian perspective, but also we don't show the solidarity within the EU and outside the EU, we will lose the political support, we will lose the legitimacy of what we are doing. So this is absolutely crucial in my view.
Absolutely. And Mr. Heeger, one last question to you. How will these developments affect the world of work, and what is our role as trade unions in protecting the rights of our workers during these transitions?
Yeah, as we said, I mean, we're facing uncertain times, we're facing hardships, we're facing cuts in our wealth, we are facing pressure, we will be facing enormous pressure on the labor markets. I mean, if you just think also of these very important, let's say, movements of migration, which also certainly will exert some pressure on our labor market, in addition to all what has been said in terms of shift of the different policy fields and the basic intention to become, let's say, independent in many regards. But what also strikes me a little bit, what worries me is like, so Fabian was saying it, or a German president was saying it yesterday, if you, in times of hardships, you have to lower your demand. You know, it seems, for instance, now when we look at trade unions, they are striking for, I don't know, pay increase, etc. In times of war, it seems a little bit odd. So in addition to the general pressure on our wealth and our, let's say, employment, we will have the additional fact that you might think that when you have to make sacrifices, when you have to make compromises, it's not really the moment to come forward with demand, neither in terms of collective bargaining nor in terms of legislation. I was just thinking here, you know, that this proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence on the table. It has been tabled, I think, in February by the Commission, where companies are supposed, who are, let's say, supposed to watch the global supply chains in a way that their suppliers also respect environmental standards, social standards, human rights standards. Now imagine you are in a situation where you desperately need raw materials. You're not going to look for that. You will try to get these raw materials. So we get altogether a little bit, I think, more robust for the good and for the bad. But I think this will be one of the consequences. And you asked me about the role of trade unions. I think here also, as we had with the digital and green transitions, we somehow must anticipate these changes. We must deal with the consequences of these changes. And we must, as Fabian also said, deal with multiple policy fields. So we have to say a little bit goodbye to our traditional role of trade unions, but because we have to make sure also in the future that in addition to these transitions, we're facing war with tremendous upheavals, and we will have to, in the design of our trade union policies, also make sure that economies, industries, or sectors and regions remain competitive. Jobs, quality jobs are saved, that new jobs are created, as many as possible. So there, I think there will be a very, very important roles also for trade unions in the future. And I mean, by the end of the day, also in these times of hardships, they are the protective shields for workers, and we should live up and stand up in this, live up for that moment and stand up at this very moment. And also, because Fabian was a little bit referring to this very important moment also for the European Union. This is now also, we have to prove that democracies or concepts like the European Union are resilient, that we can promise cohesion, that we can live solidarity. And I think also when we look at all these years or decades back to the founding fathers, this is exactly a situation for which somehow the European Union was designed. And I must say this sense of unity, which I think is very strong, the sense of support, the sense of solidarity, at least until now, is very, very strong, shows also, at least this is my hope, that our concept is resilient. Our concept is sustainable. And I also want to say that of course, on a much smaller scale, we as a confederation of trade unions, we live this solidarity also in a certain way. And I think all the many discussions with our members show that this is the moment which shows that what we are doing, what the European Union has been standing for, matters.
Absolutely, you're right. I think what we can get out of these discussions that we had today, a very important discussion, is that there is going to be hard times. We're going to have to face difficulties. We're going to have to be transparent about it, especially for us as a trade unions. We need to say things how we are, but we also have to have vision, both short-term and long-term visions. It's going to be a time where we have to sacrifice, but as Mr. Zuleeg and also Mr. Heeger were saying, it is a time to stand together, to fight for our values. And in the face of solidarity, we need to show how strong we are when we are united. And this has to reflect in all areas of policies as well. So thank you very much for this conversation today. Thank you, Mr. Zuleeg. Thank you, Mr. Heeger. And we hope to see you again in our next conversations.
Thanks a lot, Sara. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, Fabian.